Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by author of Los Leones, Chris Evans.
Thanks for having me on, Rory. It's a pleasure. I love the podcast, so it's nice to come on.
Good, and thanks very much, mate, and really happy to have you on. This is going to be an episode on the history and heritage of Athletic Club Bilbao, which Christopher has just written a book on. So, Christopher, just before we get into things properly, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm a journalist from South Wales. I live in a small village called Caerleon. I think my interest in Basque history and Basqueness in general comes from being Welsh, but also where I live, we had Basque refugees come over during the Spanish Civil War, and so obviously my interest in that was really piqued by the story of these Basque children that came over to stay in my village. So that is why I sort of eventually moved into athletic and writing a book. So that's a bit of the background of myself and the story of how I came to write the book.
Amazing. I love how it's come from this story of, Basque refugee children coming over and settling in your village and things like that. And it's opened up this interest and fascination with a subject, and it's got to the point where you've written a book. And your book was published last week now?
Yeah, last week, March the 4th. It's been out a week now, so I'm waiting for more feedback. I don't know whether I want it or not, but yeah, I'm looking. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm nervous, but yeah, it's been out a week, just over a week now.
Yeah, it's in the post for me, so hopefully it will be here shortly. But I guess one of the kind of standout points of it is that it's one of the first and most comprehensive histories of athletic in English.
Yeah, well, that's been mentioned all the time, that it's the first English language book about athletic club. But yeah, I was, I've wanted to read a book about athletic for years and years, really. I was pretty amazed when I realised there wasn't a book about athletic club. So I thought, why not have a go at doing it myself? And I just got deeper and deeper. And luckily, I've got a lot of connections with the Basque Country, and I had a hell of a lot of help because, the history element, you don't want to get things wrong and get and piss people off, for want of a better saying, certainly athletic fans. So I had a lot of help with the research and stuff, and just the people in the Basque Country in Bilbao willing to give me help, and fact checking, reading, pointing me in the right direction. Yeah, it was great. So it's been a sort of labour of love. It was intense, but ultimately it was incredibly enjoyable, and I learned so much myself when I was writing it, and I hope it's interesting for those people like me who want to learn more about Athletic Club.
Yeah, of course. And I agree with you. It was odd to me that there wasn't already a book written in English about Athletic Club, because they're a huge club. I'd imagine that most, if not all, of the football fans over here will have heard of them, for the most part anyway. But also, I think, maybe they've heard of them by name and they'll know what Athletic Club is on the face of it, but they'll maybe not know all the kind of in-depth things related to the Basque culture, the Basque heritage, their Basque identity. And there's all these things that connect different people in different clubs around the world to Bilbao, but not a lot of people might necessarily know why. And I think that's what we're going to be going through today, and kind of having a quick look at what these identity issues and what the heritage issues are when we talk about Athletic Club. Not so much issues, but you know what I mean, all these different things that make the club what they are and what make them so special.
Yeah. I don't know if you're aware as well, Roy. There is sort of a Bilbao Celtic like fan club. Are you aware of those? I think they're the Bilbao Boys, I want to say.
That rings a bell. Yeah, I think I am aware of those at the very least. Anyway.
Yeah. I think there's a lad called Tony who runs. I'm in a Athletic Club WhatsApp group with him. I'm sure he's involved in that. But yeah, just so you're aware.
Tony, if you're listening, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. It'd be great to pick your brains about going to Bilbao and getting over to some games, especially. And yeah, I think that's one thing we'll definitely discuss, as well as this link between Bilbao and Celtic and other similar clubs, if you like. Not to spoil it too much, but just for our listeners, for a quick introduction, Athletic Club, Athletic Bilbao, Athletic Club Bilbao, as they're kind of most commonly known as over here, I suppose, are a Spanish football club, or Basque football club, we should say, and that's going to be an important point we come on to later. They're a Basque football club based in Bilbao, of course, known as Los Leones, which is the title of Christopher's book, which translates to the Lions, roughly. And they're a very special club for the things that they do for the local community, the types of players that they sign, and the things that they represent for the wider Basque population and what they do to give them a voice, I suppose, is probably the best way of putting it. So, Christopher, why don't you take us back to the very beginning of Athletic Club and tell us a little bit about their history from founding?
Okay, no pressure on me now, but there's a lot. I mean, the history of Athletic Club is amazing. It sort of initially dates back to the industrialization of Bilbao, and there were historical ties with Britain. So there were lots of the steel industry and the iron industry, and there were British migrant workers coming to Bilbao. There were also lots of Basque students, the children of the rich Basque people going over to Britain to study. And I think then in the late 19th century, they were sort of having a kick around. Basically, the British migrant workers having a kick around literally on the side of the Nervion River in a place called the Campo de los Ingleses, which is and at the time football was not a thing really in the Basque Country. I think that people were fascinated by these British workers kicking a ball around on the side of the river while they were bored, waiting to do their work, or not, as it seems. And they got fascinated with it, and they became involved. And so they were they had a kick around with the locals, these British migrant workers, and then the Basque students were coming back to Bilbao with a love of football, with a love of the game. And so it sort of grew from there, and they moved to a place called the Mayaco. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they played football on a local football pitch. And then eventually this sort of grew and grew. And then in 1898, this is the official club date, Athletic Club were formed in Cafe Garcia in the city. And that is sort of the history of it. It is disputed, the actual official date. Athletic Club say 1898. There are a few other historians who say 1894. But that's basically the background, formed by British migrant workers and Basque students. And really, a few years after their formation in 1898, they went on to just dominate. I mean, if you look at the Copa del Rey, it would have been called the Copa del Coronación. I mean, they won it for about, 15 times in the first 20 years of it being going. And Athletic were the team in Spain. They were the biggest team. There's no doubt about that. So the history is fascinating. I mean, I go into it in a lot more detail in the book, obviously. But it is really fascinating. And you're finding out that they were, even though they're known now for this Basque-only philosophy, they were obviously British and Irish players playing for Athletic. When I was doing my research, I actually found out the first person to score a hat-trick for Athletic Club was called Walter Evans, which was my grandfather's name. Unfortunately, it wasn't my grandfather who was netting for the Lions. But there's so much history, and I try to cover as much as I can. I had to work, unfortunately, but I'm sure those who are interested in history, like myself, and the history of football clubs, you can certainly go down a rabbit hole with Athletic Club because you learn more and more all the time.
Definitely. It's a really fascinating thing looking at the roots and origins of different clubs. What interests me about clubs in the Basque Country and Catalonia and Spain as a kind of wider entity, if you like, is that a lot of the early clubs that were formed by working class migrant workers from the UK. There's a huge Scottish influence. Sevilla's first president was Scottish John Edwards Farquharson or something, I think his name was.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and one of I think two of Spain's oldest football clubs, one called Rio Tinto, I think their name was, and another one called Recreativo de Huelva, are some of their oldest football clubs, and they were founded by Scottish workers. And it's the same kind of scenario where they're overworking in the mines, they're working in textile mills, they're working in all these different industries that saw the same rise to football clubs in the UK and in Scotland and in Ireland and elsewhere. So it's great how there's that connection and how these different things influenced it. But as you said, it's kind of a bit of a far cry now from their Basque-only philosophy. But, those are the origins and those are the roots, and that's something that can't be disputed. But also, the reason that they then went towards a Basque-only philosophy is quite important in itself, and something that's that needs to be discussed, and something that's not just only fascinating, but I think is vital for the Basque community as well. And we'll get on to talk about that a little bit later on. But as you said, they became the dominant force in football in the Basque Country in Spain pretty quickly. So did this kind of continue for a while? Did it tail off eventually, or did just kind of go through the years? Of course, we need to touch on the fact that they then entered a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, which had pretty disastrous consequences for members of the community they would represent.
I think when you ask about did they dominate for a while, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, Rory. It was the Civil War that stopped it. I mean, pretty much up until that period, Athletic were dominant. They won, Copa del Rey after Copa del Rey. They won. There was a local regional championship, which it sounds like they could have put 7 players out and won every year. They won La Liga, numerous times. In the 1920s, they were. That's when they had a real successful period as well, and they had an English manager called Fred Pentland. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's sort of not really known in Britain, apart from football hipsters like us, as we're known, I suppose. And he's seen as a sort of a deity in Bilbao. He's a god, Mr. Pentland, and he's really revered. And there's a Peña named after Mr. Pentland. And he brought, even though Athletic were known for an English style of play initially, he brought this sort of more fluid, passing, attacking football to Athletic. He was incredibly successful, and he's still seen as well. I think he is still the most successful manager in Athletic Club's history. So that was in the 20s, and then obviously the 30s they were still doing well, and then obviously when the Spanish Civil War broke out, I mean Athletic were undoubtedly the club most affected by the Spanish Civil War, as the Basque. The Basque Country suffered just terrible repression and terrible problems. But yeah, until the Civil War, Athletic were the team in Spain.
Of course, and to give some historic context to any of our listeners who aren't aware of this, when the Spanish Civil War kicked off, when the Franco government took over, and it was essentially a war between Franco and his fascist Falangist party and anarchist and communist forces. Franco, of course, won. And a lot of regions of Spain, which themselves are autonomous, such as the Basque Country, Catalonia, etc., especially the Basque Country, where they have quite a distinctively different culture and language and different traditions, was repressed very heavily because Franco wanted this all sort of Spanish, not united Spain, because that suggests some form of unity. He was just repressing for the sake of repressing, really oppressing anything that was different so that he could then effectively colonize those areas, almost like with Spanish culture. Not, I don't want to say integrated or assimilated, because that suggests that it was quite peaceful, but it wasn't. It was literally just wiping them out so he could replace them with Spanish people and Spanish-speaking citizens.
Yeah, he was completely obsessed with the Hispanicization of everything. He said about Spanish unity, Franco, and as you just mentioned, Rory, it wasn't about Spanish unity. It was. I mean, the Basque Country, one of the worst areas that suffered. The White Terror. They had people just killed. I mean, I think the amount of Basque people that were killed following the Civil War, never mind during the Civil War, is quite frightening. That they had the repression of they weren't allowed to speak their language, which is the thing that is ingrained in their culture, their identity. It's known as euskera or euskera. It was so important and still is so important to their identity, and it was outlawed. Franco was that petty. He outlawed the Icarina, which is the Basque flag. It just went even though it's said that Franco actually admired the Basques, which when you look at the way he treated them in the Basque Country, it's quite frightening, because you think, well, how did he admire the Basque deep down when he's just treating them like that? But the Basques are defiant people. If you meet them, I've just spent 4 days in Bilbao, and they generally are the most friendly people you can meet. But you also don't want to piss them off, because they're also stubborn and they're strong-willed, and they have got that. They've suffered tragedy and repression throughout their history, so they got that toughness. There's no doubt about it. So they're super friendly, but rightfully so. They're defensive, and they don't trust everybody, perhaps, and that's no wonder if you look at history.
Definitely, and I think that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about later on as well. It does relate to what we're discussing today in terms of generational trauma, especially when you have something like the Spanish Civil War, where, I mean, there are potentially still people living who went through it and suffered through it, so now this is just my own ignorance, if you like to call it, or my own lack of knowledge. Would I be right in saying that Athletic Club, through the Spanish Civil War and for a large period of the Franco dictatorship, were basically consigned in exile to playing in local tournaments? They weren't allowed to compete at the top levels of football in Spain.
Well, during the Civil War, I don't know if you mind me talking about this. I've written a short chapter. So there was a team called euzkadi, the Basque Country, that was sent by the lehendakari, which is like the president of the Basque Country, Aguirre, who'd actually played for Athletic Club. They were sent to tour the world to raise funds for the Basque Country struggle during the Civil War, but also raise funds for the refugees who'd been sort of dispersed across Europe to places like the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and so forth. And that the story of the euzkadi football team. So I think they were more or less an extension of Athletic Club. There were 7 or 8 players. I mean, there were some other brilliant players from other clubs as well, but they were amazing. The story of them, they were almost unbeatable, touring the world, beating everybody, raising funds, and the story of the euzkadi team, it was amazing, really. And it's also quite scary because lots of them ended up just staying in South America. So they ended up going to Mexico and Argentina and Cuba and playing there and winning there. But obviously, when the Civil War ended, I think a few of them came back. One of them did desert and go back to Spain. But a lot of them ended up just staying and playing football in South America. I mean, turning out for the big clubs like River Plate and San Lorenzo and things like that. So then, but yeah, Athletic again, the repression they suffered. Franco, he was obsessed, wasn't he? He was petty. He's got the short man syndrome. He got rid of members of the club. He would let them compete in certain things. It's just, they suffered it, but they're defiant. And come the 40s and 50s, certainly in the 50s, Athletic again, they sort of rose from the flames, and they had a player called Telmo Zarra, who was just unbelievable. If you look at his goal scoring record, it is almost like it's been made up. But again, I think that goes back to what I'm saying about the Basques being, tough. They were suffering this repression, but they just didn't give in. And following the Civil War, although they were against it, they sort of rose up and they had great success. And I think that was a big 2 fingers to what was going on in Spain, really.
I completely agree. And it's one of these things that when a club which represents a repressed people then becomes successful, despite the repression, and through the repression, it is like a big middle finger to the dictatorship, and it inspires people. It gives them a sense of hope. It gives them a sense of self-worth. It gives those people that the club are representing something to hold on to, and gives them a vehicle for their values and their belief systems and things like that. It's all very, very fascinating the deeper you go into this. So after the Civil War into the 40s and 50s, athletic clubs start, as you said, rising from the ashes, and they start becoming successful again and having some incredible players by the sounds of things. Was this when the Basque-only policy, if you like, came into play, or did that come a little bit later on?
No, so the Basque-only policy came, I'm going to get this date right, I think it's the 1911, I'll say Copa del Rey, because it's changed. It was called the Copa del Generalissimo during Franco's reign. But they won the Copa del Rey, and their Basque rivals, Real Sociedad, in 1911, complained that Athletic had fielded an ineligible player. And this is the sort of thing I love, and it's very Basque. Athletic, they were annoyed. I think they refused to play in the Copa the following year, Athletic, but they also said, right then, well, if you're claiming we've done this, we will never play with anything else other than Basque players. So I think I put it as a cutting your nose off to spite your face policy. That they've chosen voluntarily to play with one arm behind their back, one leg behind their back, one arm behind their back, and I just think that's amazing, and I just think it's a prime example of Basqueness, of just being, I'll sod you then. Well, we're going to do that. And that's where it came from in 1911. And they haven't had a footballer who wasn't Basque or formed in the Basque Country, in inverted commas, since. So yeah, that's been going over 100 and whatever years now. And it's pretty impressive that they continue to compete, not just compete at the top, as, showing the success they had throughout their history. Not so much in the last 30, 40 years. But the fact they're in the Copa del Rey final shows you that they can still compete at the highest level.
Exactly. So that'll be 113 years now, I think, since that was put in place. And I love that it's come from this thing, like you said, it's like cutting your nose off to spite your face. It's like, right, okay, well, if you're complaining, then we'll just not play a player that isn't Basque again. Stuff is, and then it's become this thing that's so intrinsically tied to who they are as a club, but also for the community. But it's when a lot of people hear the name, and one of the things that they'll know about Athletic Club is that that's maybe one of the only facts, and it's seen as a bit of trivia, like they can only sign Basque players and they only play Basque players and things like that. And I just find it really fascinating how it's evolved over time from this thing that effectively was just a bit of like snide pettiness.
Yeah. Well, it is as well. I think it's particularly fascinating that it was against Real Sociedad that they were the ones who complained. You know, they're Basque rivals, and they've notoriously got a friendly relationship. Although I have spoken to a lot of Athletic fans that absolutely hate them. So it's, you know, I keep using the sibling rivalry analogy, which I know some people don't like, but that's how it feels like with Real Sociedad and Athletic Club. They sort of love each other, but they absolutely hate each other at the same time. You know, I think they find it quite confusing themselves. But I like the fact that the policy, by extension, has come from Real Sociedad and the whinge about them. So Athletic was like, well, you know, it is like a fight between two brothers. You know.
Yeah, it's a cool little origin point. It's a nice wee anchor into the history of the two clubs, and I think that's quite a good term. It's like two brothers fighting, because I don't know the politics of football in the Basque Country. Obviously, Real, we know, means royal with Real Sociedad. So again, I don't know the background to that. If there should be more of a bit of rivalry there. If Real Sociedad consider themselves more Spanish over Basque, I don't know.
No, I don't think Real Sociedad. In fact, when I interviewed Phil Ball, who is he wrote the book Morbo about Spanish football, the history of Spanish football. He's a Real Sociedad fan, and I think they see themselves actually as the more Basque club, even though I think most people would probably agree Athletic Club are the representation of the Basque Country. I'd be killed by other fans of other Basque teams, you know, Alaves and so forth, but I think that just goes purely on the basis that Athletic Club are the most successful and the biggest club in the Basque Country. That's why they're seen as the representation of the Basque Country. But Real Sociedad are very Basque. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it's a region with a huge identity tied to them, and it's just kind of elements and layers to why people from the Basque region think and how their values are. So Athletic Club continued to rise, they continued to be more successful, they had their Basque-only policy, and then of course, you come into the 60s and the 70s, Franco is obviously on his way out the door, he's losing his grip on Spain, but there's also campaigns by Basque paramilitary groups, I suppose you could call them, which brings another sort of, not pressure, but it puts the spotlight on the Basque Country again, and a lot of people have this poor idea of how Basque people are, and you know, it creates a bit of a bad impression. So I think it's quite interesting comparing them to different organisations around the globe who've done similar, because you get into this discussion of, is it terrorism, is it not? And we're not going to get into that discussion today because it can be quite murky, but again, my viewpoint is that if there's a group of people who are oppressed, then it's expected that they will bite back in some way or another.
Yeah.
If their way of life is under threat of being eradicated, essentially. And this is kind of what was happening in the Basque Country at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is murky waters like that. But you're right. Yeah. So obviously, ETA, you know, it was a result of the repression they were facing, Rory, as you mentioned. But they did tend to stay out of football. Was one of the interesting things when I was researching the book about ETA, is that apart from one of the first time they actually sort of got involved in football, because they saw it as, you know, sort of an evil, you know, globalization and so forth, them being left leaning, is when there was a player called Bijante Lizarazu, who was French born, played for Athletic just for one season, but he represented the French national side, and ETA didn't like that. Told him he was playing for an enemy state. So they did try to extort money from him, but it sort of backfired on ETA. But that's the only really real time they sort of got involved with football. They tended to, you know, to target politicians and businessmen and things like that. So there is that interesting thing. They didn't really get involved in Athletic Club, as far as we know, too much. You know, I'm sure there was a lot going on, but you know, it was inevitable that something like that is going to happen, purely because of the repression that the Basque Country was experiencing, and probably still does to an extent. You know.
Mm-hmm. No, I'd completely agree with you. It's something we're not going to go into too much about. It's important to provide the context of it.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting though that they targeted this player that, you know, represented the French national team and things like that. But there was obviously these campaigns going on by the ETA, but Athletic Club kept going and they kept pushing through. It's incredible because you hear from other countries and other clubs who represent people who are being repressed, and in some cases there's genocide going on. The clubs will fold, they're forced to fold, and they're pretty much gotten rid of and wiped off the face of the map pretty quickly. If you read The Defiant by Chris Lee and Power Players by Ronnie Blaschke, it goes through kind of similar situations in different countries around the world and different dictatorships. But it's amazing how Athletic Club were just able to keep going. They kept pushing through it, and it kind of comes back to this idea of what you mentioned, that the Basque people are very resilient and very strong, and they just weren't willing to let this thing die that represented them, and it's incredibly admirable, and they managed to fight through. Obviously, Franco passed away. Spain officially stopped becoming a fascist state. They survived all the way through, and now they're still doing pretty well. They're still in La Liga, still playing at the top tiers of Spanish football, and things have been going pretty well for them considering what they had up against them.
Yeah, so following Franco's death, I mean, I assume you might be aware of this. There was a famous incident in, I want to say, 1976, where the flag, the Icarina, was still outlawed. So I've written about it a lot in my book in quite detail. So it was outlawed, but during the Basque Derby at Atocha Stadium in Donostia, San Sebastian, Athletic Club against Real Sociedad, the two captains, Jose Angel Iribar, who is the Athletic goalkeeper, and he is probably the number one icon of Athletic Club, carried out along with his opposing captain Cortaberia for Real Sociedad, carried out the Icarina, and it's just become part of Basque history, Basque folklore, because it was still outlawed, even though Franco had died by this point. It was a show of solidarity between the clubs. It was an example again of their Basqueness, that rivalry, but ultimately they're all fighting for the same cause of being Basque and fighting oppression. And the story goes, the story is more to the story, where there was a Real Sociedad player whose idea it was. He was a sort of bit part player, and I keep forgetting his name every time I talk about him. He got his sister to sort of make this flag. He snuck it past security, the dogs, and everything. Everything. I don't think he wasn't even playing in the match. If you look at the famous picture of the flag with the two captains holding it, he's behind it. You can just see his blue jeans popping out at the bottom. And the story of it is fascinating. They sneaking a flag. It sounds mad, but they had to sneak it in, and it was a big thing. And that it was an emotional event, and it is seen. There's the iconic picture of them carrying the flag, and they sometimes recreate that on anniversaries. The two clubs. But it's an amazing event that really stands out in Basque history.
Yeah, I'm kicking myself now because that's something that I wanted to mention is the flag and this iconic moment in football history where they carry that flag out. The photo is one of the most iconic moments in the history of football, and I can't remember what book it was. I read it, and maybe it was either Emancipation for Goalposts or one of the books that I mentioned previously, where they discussed that, and they mentioned his sister stitching it together, and how at that time it was like a massive show of solidarity, a show of support, and a show of defiance, and we're not going away sort of thing. You can't get rid of us. But because the dictatorship was really, really waning by that point, they couldn't do anything. It was amazing, and you're absolutely right in saying that it's a completely foreign subject to us, or a foreign concept, sorry, that we can't take a flag into a football stadium, depending on where you live. Of course, for us in the UK, it's a completely foreign concept, but that was the type of repression that those people were dealing with at that point in time.
And it sounds so petty, doesn't it? But it was seen, even though Franco died, it was seen as a separatist flag. It had the terrorist connotation to sort of the Spanish right wing. But other flags weren't outlawed. The Galician flag and the Catalonian flag, for them to show, and actually it became legalized the following year, maybe, or the year after, 2 years later. So that actual event really led to the Icarina being made legal again, which is, again, I feel ridiculous saying that, as you mentioned, Rory, but it's a really historic occasion, and if you look at the photographs, if you put them on Twitter, they are amazing. There is one on the back of my book that Athletic Club kindly gave me, but yeah, there's a few of them, and they're brilliant. But look out for the guy's blue jeans. He was the guy who was the main protagonist, really, of doing it. And his sister didn't know what she was doing the flag for, and then she heard about it on the radio. It was like this big outrage, and she's like, "Oops!" But it's a really great story.
Mm-hmm. No, it's fantastic, and yeah, again, coming back to it, it's the connotations associated with it because it had been outlawed, which again is crazy. there was the association with right-wing groups and ultra-nationalist groups, if you like, but, for the majority of people in the Basque Country, it's their flag. It doesn't mean anything else other than it's what represents them. It's their colours, So just a fantastic moment in the history of football, and that was the moment that you could say that, as you said, the flag became legal again, and it sounds bad saying that it became normalised again, but that's when it was people could be Basque again. They were always Basque and they were Basque in their own communities, but now it's just that kind of confirmation that they needed. That
Yeah, well, they gone from having to speak. They had to speak Basque, in private. It was illegal. You were thrown in jail for speaking Basque and things like that. And I don't think it's any coincidence that just a few years later, following the showing of the Icarina, that Real Sociedad won the league. I think 1980, made 2 years in a row, and then Athletic Club won the league. So I think it all links together. It's just to show that it's almost like the freedom. The Basque Country won their freedom back all of a sudden, and it just showed in everything, culturally and linguistically. Obviously, they were allowed to speak their language again, but also with sport, they obviously thrived in the late 70s and early 80s again. So it all sort of come together. It's it's really fascinating period of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good story as well. It just goes to showing, there's many other peoples and loads of other football clubs out there who are still repressed today. They're fans aren't allowed to fly certain flags. Belarus, for example, you get some fans in Egypt. It still happens today.
Yeah.
But into the modern era now, Athletic Club are still doing pretty well by all accounts. I mean, a couple of ups and downs here and there within La Liga, but for the most part, it's been steady sailing, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So probably in the last 30, 40 years, obviously since Javier Clemente's double winning team, that's what they looking back, they're hankering back to that. When the double in 1983-84, they took out the barge rather than going out on a bus, they go out on something called La Gabarra, which goes along the river. And that's a historical occasion where they think there was 1 million people on the streets celebrating their win. That's the last time it's been taken out, La Gabarra. They've not won a trophy. They have won a couple of Super Coppers, which is sort of like the Spanish equivalent to the Community Shield, I suppose. But they still haven't got that elusive La Liga or Copa del Rey, which obviously now they've got a chance on April the 6th against Mallorca to do that, which I'm praying they win it, but I'm also worried that my book's going to be out of date within a month of its release. There've been a lot of ups and downs. Sorry, I should say. They had a period in the early 2000s called the Bienio Negro, where they almost got relegated, and that is when they really started questioning their philosophy, their Basque-only philosophy. But they came out of that period, thankfully, and they've saw mid-table finishes and so forth. But certainly this year, I mean, they're playing some amazing football. They're pushing for Champions League place if possible. If not Europa League, they're in the Copa del Rey final. So, look, when I say that this Basque-only philosophy, obviously it makes it harder for themselves, but they're still competing and they're still at the top. And I'm really hoping that they end up their 40-year duck and win the Copa del Rey in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's a philosophy that has its obvious cons and drawbacks. Like, I think that's quite clear to see, but the reasons for them doing it now, where it's, this kind of community-based thing and they're wanting to represent the people that they feel like they represent, that's why they're doing it ultimately, and it's important to understand why that is. But again, the fact that they're able to do it and they're still able to compete is incredibly impressive, and I think that leads us quite nicely on to the next part of the podcast. That's kind of a quick blast through the history of Athletic Club. There's so much more to than that you can check in Chris's book, Los Leones. Please pick it up because it's going to be a fantastic and really fascinating read, and I'm really looking forward to getting it. But one of the areas that I wanted to touch on, of course, and this comes into everything we've spoken about, is the kind of heritage elements that are present here within Athletic Club and it can be present in loads of other clubs. And we've basically answered it and spoken about it already. But as I said, we'll talk about some other clubs that have kind of come to mind here and that kind of have similar setups, if you like, in terms of heritage. But obviously we've said that Athletic Club act as the representative of the Basque population. Not the entire population, you have fans of other teams such as Sociedad and Alaves, like you've mentioned, but I guess the one thing that was on my mind is how do they act as the representative of the Basque population? And through history, you've had the Civil War, and people identified with them as their vehicle for their identity. But how do they do it now?
I mean, that's a really difficult question, as you mentioned, all the intricacies of just the Basque, not just the Basque Country, but in different, in Biscaya and Gipuzkoa. It's the Basque Country is so fascinating because there's so much going on within that small nation. But I would say Athletic are a reflection of Basque people, as we briefly went over, of the Basque people identity, their history, their culture. There's no doubt about that. I think Athletic perhaps a reflection of Basque people in that. Yeah, they are a little bit enclosed. There's no denying that. They are sort of cut themselves off a little bit, but they've also want to be part of the world historically. They are internationalists, the Basque people. Historically, they were the great explorers and the conquistadors, the great industrialists. So, they're complicated. Like the politics, like the history of the Basque Country, the people are complicated. There's no definitive answer. But I think Athletic represent that because they are, like I just mentioned, like Basque people, maybe a bit enclosed, but they also want to be part of the world. They're conscious of how big they are. They're conscious of playing in Europe. Is the main thing for Athletic Club is to play in Europe. They're modern. They're modernising all the time. So Athletic Club are an extension or a reflection of the Basque Country, as are the other clubs: Osasuna, Alaves, Eibar, Real Sociedad. But it's undeniable that Athletic are the biggest club. So they're the ones who get the recognition, maybe, shall we say. But also historically, Athletic were linked to the PNV, the sort of centre-right group in the Basque Country, and there's no denying that they got links there. But I just think it's a complicated one where the Basques are enclosed. They are a bit sort of standoffish, but then on the flip side of that, they are internationalists. They do want to be out there. They do want to be modern. They do want to share their culture. And they do want to learn about other cultures, hence why so many Basque students went to Britain during the formation, around the time of the formation of Athletic Club. And so you could talk about this. This is a podcast in itself, probably, Rory, talking about the intricacies and how Athletic Club are a representation of the Basque Country. But yeah, I think they definitely are. They're linked with everything: the culture, the language. You just have to go to Bilbao, and I think. What's unique, what I always notice when I go there is that it's a relatively big city, but it's a one club city, which is quite rare. So everyone likes Athletic Club. Everyone is fascinated. Everyone's got a link. Everybody knows someone who's been there. It makes it so special. You talk to somebody, if you run out of things to say, you talk about Athletic Club, and that everybody there in Bilbao has got a passion and will tell you. I got a story actually from last week when I went to Bilbao. And I was talking to the taxi driver on the way home. I have my family in the car, and I found out I'd written a book about Athletic, and he refused to charge me. He didn't want to charge me. I did pay, by the way, because I couldn't handle that. That would be on my conscience too much. But he just like, no, you're not paying. Da, da, da. It was just they're fascinating. They just want to help you. But the Basque people and the Basque Country is complicated, but that's what makes it so amazing, I think, and that's what makes Athletic Club so amazing.
It's a brilliant story. And I think it links into this idea just how strongly of how people in the Basque Country feel about their football teams and people who are doing things that reflect their identity and talking about them and their culture, which is really, really brilliant. As you said, it could be a complete other podcast talking about the Basque Country, the different politics at play, how the politics bleeds into the football, which football club represents which political party. It's so many different things and so many different elements and ideologies at play. And I think through this entire discussion, we've kind of found the sticking point of why Basque people feel so strongly about their identity, because it's different and they've always been different in a good way. They want to be citizens of the world, but because of the repression and because of civil war, which and the repression, by the way, happened long before the civil war as well. It wasn't just
throughout the whole history, yeah.
Exactly. Then they have every right to be a little bit walled off and feel like they have to protect themselves and their own community. It's completely understandable. But as you said, they want to be citizens of the world and they want to be recognised for their culture and their language and everything else, which is kind of... And this is what I was saying that was sort of similar to other football teams, because obviously Celtic is a club that I support. I'm not saying that we are completely like Athletic Club, because we're not, but in the 70s and 80s, you had the Chief of Police Scotland writing to Parliament to take down the Irish tricolour from Celtic Park, which, Celtic it was a club founded in Scotland, but for our listeners who don't know, there's a huge Irish connection there. Founded by Irish people for Irish people is the short of it. The club has always been very close to its roots in Ireland. So to take that down would be to take away the identity of a lot of people, because that's the colours that they identify with. This was a club founded by and largely for an Irish population, ended up incorporating the Scottish population because they wanted to be a mix of the two. But Celtic without their Irish roots, to me, is just another football team that it's not the same. And you've got other clubs throughout the world as well, FC Palestino in Chile, who represent the Palestinian population over there. Yeah. You've got clubs from all over the world who have these kind of similar things and are all bound by this kind of oppression through the years and through different things. And not to say they're directly similar, but as we mentioned earlier, there is this sort of generational trauma and sort of shared experience from ancestors or otherwise that link all these clubs together, and there's a bit of a similarity to them.
Yeah, I think that definitely is. I think you were trying not to say that Celtic are similar to Athletic Club a little bit. I think they are very similar, like you said, the flag and the sort of the politics, the repression they've faced, and taking flags out and things like that. Again, we've already touched on that. But Athletic Club have got a good relationship. I know they got a good relationship with Celtic. They got a good relationship with Newcastle. That comes from a European game they played a while back. But there are also historical ties with Southampton as well, to do with the kit. Although Sunderland, there's a group of Sunderland claiming that it's from Sunderland because there's links with the Northern England. I'm sitting on the fence on that one. But yeah, there's definitely that element. I think Celtic are another club that really interests me. But there's plenty of books about them, Rory, so I kind of got in there. But yeah, I think it's important. It's just politics and football they can't be separated, no matter how much you try. Football is culture, history, tradition, and politics. They all merge into one. And if there is a football team that hasn't got that, I don't know about it, or they're not interesting to me. I think it's so important to be part of the area you're from and represent the history of what happened and things like that. But yeah, Celtic are another amazing club, just like Athletic Club. I would say that.
Yeah, it's just really fascinating. I completely agree with you that football and politics can be separated. Even if you support a club that are the most unpolitical entity on the planet, to be unpolitical is in itself a political act.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people don't know that and don't see that as well. But one thing that I did want to ask is kind of moving into the era of modern football. It was on Celtic releasing their Adidas collection where they said that this kit, harks back to their Irish roots. It's horrible. It looks shit. It looks terrible. And it's this kind of thing where, a lot of football clubs are using their fans' identities and the club's heritage to basically as a cash grab. We'll put out this thing, we'll say it's Irish, they'll buy it, we'll get more money. It's one of those ones. Loads of clubs do it, especially the Adidas clubs, and I'm under no illusions that Celtic is a commercial club. They're moving towards a larger kind of commercialisation thing, but in doing that, they lose touch with their fans and the roots of the club. And to be honest with you, I think Celtic and the board are probably as far away for the last while that they can be in terms of being as out of touch with the fan base at the moment anyway.
Okay, yeah.
And one thing that I wanted to ask is, in the era of modern football, as you mentioned, they were, rethinking the Basque-only philosophy. Has Athletic Club's identity been diluted?
Oh God, that is a tough question, Rory. So I would say, from my point of view, again, I don't live in Bilbao. It would be good to speak to people who are there in the club, what they think. I wouldn't say it's more diluted because the Basque, the Basque-only philosophy is still as strong as ever. But there's no doubt that Athletic are moving with the times. They have to modernise. They have to compete. Things like, you could talk about ticket prices. I don't know if that's the same at Celtic, Rory. Things like that. If you're looking at a working class family of four to go and watch a match, even at Athletic Club, you'd be looking at €200 at least. So there is that element of them maybe diluted that way, but they're still a people's club. They're still ingrained in the culture. They've still got the Basque philosophy. They still look at they still look out for their fans to an extent. But then I know somebody I know was banned for a couple of games for bringing a flag in not long ago in Athletic. I'm not going to go in any deeper there, but so there is that element happening there as well. I think that's just unfortunately the way that football, like you say, the commercialization, the globalization. I want to go neoliberalism. God, you could start me now. But I'm not going to go on. I'm not going to go on that front. But yeah, they maybe dilute to an extent. But they stick to their roots. Like any other club, Athletic fascinated with their history. Sometimes their history is almost more important than what's going on now. So they do stick to their guns. And but yeah, that is a tough question. I think clubs aren't. It's just the way football's going. If they want to compete, they have to change a little bit. In this modern, probably it's quite depressing to think that with clubs like Celtic and Athletic Club, all these great clubs, but they have to move, otherwise they're not going to exist, I suppose. But what I do like about Athletic is that the Basque only philosophy still seems, everyone I spoke to said it should stay. Not one person told me they want it to end. I interviewed Anthony Goycochea, known as the Butcher of Bilbao, but don't call him that because he hates it. He said about sort of maybe tweaking the philosophy, so the Basque diaspora in like South America and the rest of Spain could maybe play for Athletic, but there's nobody else wants that to change. I don't think Athletic Club could become too commercialized. They're owned by the fans, the socios, and I don't think they would allow it. But there's no doubt that it's happening. The same as Celtic. Celtic fans are amazing, but sometimes you can't stop those higher than you doing things that you don't want to do.
Yeah, I think that's it as well. Is that it's in this kind of area of modern football, there have to be concessions somewhere, and I completely understand that. But it's whether the concessions come in terms of higher ticket prices, which again is something that I don't agree with. But would you rather the ticket prices be a bit pricier than your club basically giving up its identity and giving up what it's meant to stand for? And I know that can kind of play a part in that as well, but if you weigh the two up, then I think, in my opinion anyway, one is more important than the other, and that's the identity of the club, essentially. So it's good to know that kind of Basque only philosophy that Bilbao or Athletic Club Bilbao are pushing is something that's going to stick around as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and it's something that I obviously talk about a lot, as our listeners know. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. So if there's anyone from Bilbao who supports the club listening, then please do get in touch, because we'd love to hear more just about what you think and other things as well. I think it's quite good as well to include diaspora. I think that's something that's quite important. But again, this is from someone who's never watched a Bilbao game, has never been to Bilbao or the Basque Country. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, and you will go to Bilbao, and there'll be people with hugely contrasting opinions of what the club should do, where they're going, how they're doing. But there's no doubt they're still ingrained. They're still properly Basque. They're still involved in everything that they're involved in literature festivals. They do it promoting the Basque language. They've got a Twitter in Basque, a Twitter in Spanish, a Twitter in English. Athletic know what they're doing. They are involved in society, in Basque society and culture. There's no doubt about that. So when I say diluted, about modernizing, I think that's inescapable for them. But yeah, as a historic club and staying true to their roots, yeah, they're still pretty hot on that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's actually going to ask you, have you read The Roaring Red Front by Stuart McGill and Vince Raison?
No, I haven't. Tell me more about that, Roy, because that's going to be on my list by the sounds of it.
Yeah, so it's another book released through Pitch Publishing. Stuart McGill owns and operates and runs it's not karate, it's a mixed martial arts gym in London. And is a huge football fan, as is his co-author Vince, and they basically tour the world going around different football clubs which are perceived to be left-leaning, which was quite interesting. And two of the clubs that they actually touched on were Rayo Vallecano and Cadiz. And just kind of coming back to what we were speaking about there, I can't remember which club it was, but I think it's maybe Rayo Vallecano. There's a lot of issues going on right now with their ownership, their owner, and the fans protesting against it because he's trying to take away certain parts of their identity, trying to move them from the neighbourhood they're in. There's a traditionally very working class club, so there's been a lot of problems there.
Yeah.
But it's good to know that Athletic Club are fan owned, so there's a chance that couldn't happen. Obviously, never say never. We know what with the times that we're living in with football and things, anything can happen. But it's good to know that they're kind of still there as this bastion of not just fan ownership, but fan representation and sticking to their guns, sticking to the roots, etc., etc. When all these other clubs around them are being bought and sold, like bargaining chips, basically.
No, it's it is depressing when you say about the money and these clubs being bought out. A prime example is Girona in Spain. They're second. They were top of the league. And it just shows you that unfortunately money does buy things, but the sports washing doesn't wash with us fans. A lot of us fans, I don't think. So it is refreshing. Clubs like you said, Rayo Vallecano. I know they're very left leaning, and they're a brilliant club actually. If you look into the history of it, I don't know so much about Cadiz. I'd be interested to know about that. But I know the Athletic Club fans went there not long ago and had a really warm welcome, and again that sort of convivial interaction between fans. But yeah, I haven't read that book though, but that is definitely going to be on my list now, Rory. So yeah, although I'm meant to be promoting my book, never mind him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think above all from today's conversation, we should say definitely go out and pick up Chris's book. It's available now to order from Waterstones, Amazon, Pitch Publishing, whoever you get your books from. Very, very in-depth story of Athletic Club and their history, and pretty much touching on all the themes and discussing the themes that we've spoken about today. This is obviously just an hour long or so, there's only so much we can go through within that period of time, and hopefully it's touched on pretty much everything that's important to Athletic Club. I've certainly got through all the things that I wanted to ask and talk about. Is there anything else you'd wanted to mention, Chris? Any other themes we've not touched on? Any other stories you maybe want to mention?
I mean, we've only got so much time. The Williams brothers stories is a fascinating one to look at. If you read my book, I've talked about the Iñaki and Nico Williams. Again, it's to show that Athletic are moving in modern times because they're the sons of migrants from Ghana. That's a fascinating story. But yeah, we just, like you said, we just scratched the surface here. So some of the things we talked about, I go into a lot more depth in the book. I hope I've covered everything in depth as much as people will find it interesting. I try not to go into too much depth because you don't want to bore people. But certainly, I found it interesting learning so much, and I hope anybody who does buy the book enjoys it. And please give me some feedback. Yeah, that'd be great.
Definitely. As I said, the book's in the post for me, so I'll be going through it the second that I get it. I find it a very fascinating subject. Please do pick up the book and read it further, because it'll give you so much more insight into the different things that we've spoken about today, and hopefully it'll lead you to watching some Athletic Bilbao games, or maybe going over there, seeing them in person.
I'd highly recommend going over, Rory, and getting a match in. It's an experience you won't forget. It is brilliant. And while I'm talking, by the way, the name I keep forgetting is Jose Antonio de la Oz Uranga, or Josean Uranga. He's the guy whose sister did the Icarina flag. I just quickly found that because I forgot it yet again, so apologies.
Brilliant. I think that's a good point to finish up on. Of course, once again, thank you very much to all of our listeners for tuning into this episode. If there's a topic that you want us to cover that's related to football, history or heritage, identity, culture, community, politics, place, you name it, any of the themes that we have discussed in today's episode or in any of our other shows, then please do get in touch. We're more than happy to hear from you and have a chat with you about how we can make that happen. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Please also check out our website, footballheritage.co.uk, where all of our fantastic written content goes up from our contributors. But for now, Chris, if you say goodbye.
Yeah, cheers, and thanks for having me on. And keep going, Rory, because the podcast is amazing. I really love it, and you're doing a great job. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, mate, and thanks very much for coming on. That's very kind of you. But for now, it's a goodbye from me as well, and we'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.